Hello and welcome to VistaTalks, interesting discussions with interesting people from all around the world. I'm your host for today, Simon Hodgkins, and I'm happy to introduce you to Nick Hill. Nick is a technical writing manager at Here Technologies. Nick, you're very welcome to VistaTalks.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me here today to speak about topics that I actually have a great deal of interest in.
Well, let's get right into it then, Nick. I'm going to hit you with a couple of questions, but I want to start off the conversation on the hot topic everybody's involved in that we can't get away from. And my question is this. We all now see how AI, including the obvious, ChatGPT and many others, are being embedded into the documentation process. Now, what do you see as maybe some of the most promising uses of AI at the moment in terms of where we're at in technical writing? And importantly, the challenges, the risks, whether that's liability, accuracy, that maybe come with some of this AI adoption, because it's a question everybody's sort of struggling with right now.
And you'll get a great variety of answers depending upon who you ask, right? So I am just a person in the tech comms industry. I have no great special, secret crystal ball that tells me the future. But based upon conferences I've been attending here in Europe and discussions with colleagues whose judgment I really value, I think we're on a journey to discover how we actually want to use this new tool in our tech comms world. But one thing is extremely clear to me. I wrote down the meaning of the acronym here, so I always forget what it stands for, but RAG, Retrieval Augmented Generation. So what does that mean? That's a technical term, that's not transparent to a lot of people. So for me, the killer app right now is integrating an AI into your company's website that serves customers who come to you, gives them an ability to ask a natural language question about your products or about something that they're interested in that's relevant from your company, and then gives them an answer based upon the corpus or the content that is exposed to your website, right? So this is the way I like to describe it is this is clippy, but it works, right? I'm dating myself, but Microsoft did a fine job, but it was too early. I work with developer documentation and have for years and years and years, right? So that means I work in an industry that is not tightly regulated because our products can't kill people, right? Typically, the regulatory thing is not something, it's a very valid thing for large parts of my industry, but not for my part of the industry, right? But classically for us, we have the same sort of content strategy mandate from the companies that employ our units as anybody else. What is that? Two things: reduce support costs, right? Is that we want our technical customer support people to be able to dedicate the very valuable time to high touch, high value cases for our customers, right? So I think a documentation is sort of a tier one sort of a way of allowing customers to figure out whatever challenges or questions they may have. But of course, is that many companies have extensive, large amounts of documentation, and it can be actually quite a challenge to find that specific information that you're looking for. So I think using AI on your website allows people to rapidly get to that content that they actually want, because nobody's doing this for the fun of it. They're trying to solve a problem or a challenge that they have, right? Do you have a product that allows me to achieve my commercially useful goal? I can't get your product to work. What's wrong? I get this error message. What do I need to do? How do I implement this, right? So this really helps us support this divert support case, right? Which is measurable and quantifiable, which is always nice for us tech comms people, because then we can prove the value that we provide to the company, right? The other thing, and this is also very common for almost everybody in this industry, is we want to increase adoption. We want customers to fall in love with our products. I don't want to go into the details about my company's products, but we have wonderful products. We want people to use them because we issue them because we think they're very useful. And I'm sure everybody else will say the same thing about their company's products, right? And is that for developer documentation, right? Software engineers are under a lot of pressure. They have a lot of things to do, right? And the AI allows them to come into the website and say, I want to achieve this software goal with product X. And then if your AI is configured correctly, and more importantly, if the corpus on your website has the information in a manner that the AI can assume, and we'll come back to that, right, is you could potentially just give them the code that they could use to sort of trial or test how, using your product to achieve that goal, right? And that has a couple of useful things to it, right? The first thing is it allows your customer base to really rapidly sort of get their fingers in and figure out, how they actually want to use your product. But it also, and let's be honest here, it gives people the paradigm of how you would like them to use your product, which then potentially reduces support costs and potential errors, because nobody's going to redo a bit of code just because they feel like it. They might need to change it for their business cases or logic, whatever. That's natural. But if you just give them a template, they'll use that template, which means they're using your product in the way you want them to use it, in a way that's maximally effective for them and for you. Right. So for me, this is amazing, right? It means that all the effort that we collectively have invested in creating technical documentation to support our products, we can now leverage them in sort of new, innovative ways in order to allow us to achieve the business goals of our host organizations. I go around and preach to everybody, do this. I'm very happy. Early days, there's still a lot of work to be done, right?
Yeah.
But you asked me, okay, what are the challenges or risks? All right. So you notice I say embedded in your company website, right? And I've heard the term used agent. You can use chatbot. You can use different terms, right? So you referenced ChatGTP, which of course is a particular product from a particular company, and I'm not picking on them, right? If we say ChatGTP, let's think of this as, some sort of AI that you go to a website and that you ask a question from, right? And a public website that's not directly connected to a specific company. So, and I was doing a little bit of research in preparation for this talk. And I, of course, live in the EU, and we have the AI directive, and there's also an AI liability directive coming, right? That hasn't been, neither of those, but first, the AI liability directive doesn't exist yet. The AI directive hasn't been transposed into national legislation yet, right? So what I'm saying is the legal landscape is unclear. But let me give you a scenario. And this is not for me, my industry, but more generally. Say you come from a company that issues a physical product that does a useful thing for people. And say that product stops working, and that person goes to any open platform AI thingy and asks the question, how do I fix this? And they get a response. And that response is wrong for one reason or another. Not maliciously, it's just wrong. Maybe it has old data that is being used for the training set or for the data it's consuming. Maybe it's picking information from a product from another company that does the same thing but works differently, is designed differently. So God forbid, right? That person uses that information to address whatever challenge they have. The device stops working. Okay, if it's an expensive device, that's potential major loss of income. God willing, nobody gets hurt or dies, because let's be honest, there's equipment out there that can kill people if used improperly. I don't know if we have an answer for this. Who's liable? Right? Yes, of course, it says in the chat, this information may be inaccurate, whatever. But that's the equivalent of the end user license agreement. Everybody just clicks OK and goes on, right? Nobody's really internalizing that and thinking, is this correct? And even if they do, how do they check? Right? And from a company perspective, here's the worst part about this. I had no clue that even happened. right? I don't have analytics from these commercial products, which are, I'm going to call them open AI, websites, right? I don't have, I don't know if people are asking about my product. I don't know if the answers being provided are correct. I can't follow the market, which is actually sort of my legal liability here, at least in Europe, and I'm sure in the States, legal regimes are different, but they basically sort of end up in the same place, right? Is that I can't even follow what happens after we release the product. So I can't take reasonable steps to help people or to prevent liability incursion. I don't mean to say people can't use it, right? But I'm just like, my God, that makes me feel incredibly nervous. And that is the highest risk I would flag, right? Uh, and again, I'm not mean to trash any particular model or anything like that, but I'm kind of wondering, is that vendor lock-in, right? Because the business models for these things seem a little unsure, because I don't think they're making enough money from what they charge when you use it to actually pay for the cost of providing the service and developing the service. And well, DeepSeek, right? That was a lot cheaper than some other models that are out there, right? So that tells me, and I know there's controversy about the details of the all, right? And maybe this is an exaggerated concern. That tells me that the barrier to entry into this area is low. And so if you build your strategy around a particular provider, do you have any surety that provider will be around in 2 or 3 years? Because I don't think the business models are clear in this area right now. Now, people are much brighter than I am, are, of course, working on this and all this other stuff, but I don't like risk. And so these are a couple things that we need to manage as an industry, I think, and have strategies inside our own companies for how we deal with this. So you asked me about risks. Those are two of the risks I see, right? Not to mention, of course, AI is energy intensive. Will the world be able to build out the energy infrastructure we need to be able to provide this service in future? Right? Which, because of course, is projected to grow amazingly high. Is this something we can rely upon in a couple of years? Because energy is not a simple thing. There's all sorts of geopolitics and other things involved in that, right? Well, Nick, and by the way, also there's the copyright thing. Where'd the data come from? And if I rely upon this to do things, am I liable as a company for things? So, yeah, sorry, but of course this will all be sorted out in the courts. But I'd kind of like that to be done first.
Well, Nick, first of all, I loved your Clippy reference. I thought that was brilliant. It's kind of like Clippy, but it works.
Yeah.
And you started off sort of being like a strong proponent for it. This is brilliant. It's great. It helps in lots of different ways, helps us move up the value chain to some degree. But I think you've quite rightly pointed out some of those challenges or risks, which are a bit like open-ended questions at the moment. And it brings me nicely onto the next thing I want to ask you, which is we're kind of talking about today, whether it's DeepSeek, it's 20 times cheaper to get it up and running. One company maybe scraping the world's data, another company copying that company's data. The barrier to entry is certainly changing. But as you say, there's an awful lot of work and data and costs that go in the back end to provide these services. But from your crystal ball perspective, somebody that speaks at industry conferences about this whole technical writing, this important documentation space, do you think, or let me ask you, how do you envisage AI transforming the profession maybe over the next 5 to 10 years? Is it going to make technical writers more essential as the creators of truth, the editors of AI generated content? Because you were talking there a moment ago about once it goes into the black box, you've no really control. And I was talking to somebody recently who said that my brand can now listen, think, and respond for itself, meaning I've got less and less control over what it's saying about me out there, which is kind of what you were alluding to. And I'm just wondering, does it make us more curators and editors of AI content, or does it fundamentally change the playing field 5, 10 years out?
Okay, so I have a couple answers to that question. By the way, believe me, this is a topic of conversation in conferences in the industry, right? And we're sort of, the traditional curve for any new technology where there's the, woohoo, look at this is wonderful. And then we're sort of on the other downside. Oh, wait, that doesn't solve all the problems in the world, right? So we're sort of on the downside right now, and we'll equalize to figure out what it actually can do for us, right? Oh, and I know many professionals are like, are we going to be replaced? Right? Is that so? Just thinking about deploying an AI to a company website, it actually makes more work, at least at the beginning, right? Is that first off, you need to have the basics in order. Content strategy, you need to have a decommissioning strategy that you retire information that you no longer want to have out there. You need to have a pretty strong process orientation, right? All that stuff actually becomes yet more important because AI finds a bright, shining flashlight on any sins you have committed. All right. So first off, you need to get your house in order and have a pretty good control over what you're doing and how you're allocating your capacity. Right? And I'm a manager, of course, so I talk about allocating capacity. The other thing, right? So the AI is a black box, and there are debates about which AI you want to use and how you tweak it and all that kind of stuff. But actually, the funny thing is, it makes all those things that my mentor taught me 26 years ago even more relevant. Titles, clearly delineating information on individual pages, right? So titles, that transfers whether you use semantic search or keyword search to feed into your AI model. That basically translates into semantic data, right? Is that if your titles are not sharp and clear about what's actually on that page, the AI is not going to find the information that you actually need in order to provide the answer you want, right? So yeah, there's a lot of fine-tuning and things that can be done on the AI black box side, and we have experts in the AI industry who can guide us on those things, right? But as a writer, I'm like, oh my God, we have to be actually even better at how we execute the content we create, to what I would like to call fine-tune the content for an AI sort of presentation, right? Is that, and we've never, as an industry, really, I'm sure there are people somewhere, but I have never run into any of them, have really thought about, well, if a customer asks question X, do I have the information exactly correct that they'll get an answer for question X from what I have on the site, right? So from my perspective, it actually involves a massive amount of work to go through and make sure that everything we're feeding into the engine is actually up to date, tagged correctly, good titles, the information is clear, right? On a practical level, things happen, right? Is that so on the short term? And as I say, I'm quite bullish on having it in the company website, agent, let's call it that, right? That you can control. And the nice thing about that, right, and when it comes to the fine tuning, is assuming you have everything set up correctly, you can actually get data about what people are asking, what links are being used in order to provide the response to the question, what questions are not being answered, right? What answers are being given. And that allows you to do analysis on the content you have on the site to make sure that your actual content suits well. Because think about this, this is a gold mine. You have questions that your customers are actually asking, right? I'm very lucky. I have a chance to occasionally do user research with our customers, but not many writers can actually say that, right? Is that so? This is a gold mine of data that allows you to really fine tune your content strategy, right? But that's a lot of extra work, right? So first off, it increases the workload. All right, so that's one immediate short-term answer. But you asked me, well, what effect is this going to have in the industry? And I like to give a metaphor here. So I come from the Finnish tech comms industry. I had a lot of good colleagues in there who taught me a lot of very valuable things. Is that when Google Translate API deployed its neural model for that API, and I looked it up, 2016, it was a step change. right? So I have worked in the past as a translator, only finished English because that fastest there, and in that industry, it's all about word rate, right? I mean, there's 2 people in Finland who translate the great books, but everybody else word rate. Is that before they deployed that new model, English to Finnish, Finnish to English wasn't great. It is now shockingly good, right? And that you can say that about a lot of language pairs. But there are still translators, right? But what's happened is their industry has changed. And it sort of really depends where they are, if it's legal text or marketing text or other kinds of things. And still, the traditional model is still there. The great books are still there, right? So there are sort of internationalization and translation tasks where the human touch is actually very valuable and worth the money you pay for it. Right? And a lot of it, we have more text being translated now than I think ever in human history because of these tools that we have, right? So if you're working with that stuff, it's all about the volume of words per hour because the price per word is going down. The cost pressures are immense. And it's been really rough for some of my translation colleagues. I have a lot of sympathy with them, right? It's been an industry under significant change. So the ones who have been able to adopt to the new technology have been able to hopefully thrive. Is that potentially that might be us in 10 years in tech comps, right? Is that one of the reasons I go to conferences is I like to tell my colleagues is that, look, we need to take ownership of figuring out where using these tools are valuable and where they're not so valuable, because we actually understand what our daily working lives are like. And if we can control moving up that value chain, that puts us in a much better position to discuss with our senior business leadership about the value we provide for the companies we work for, because we do provide, in my mind, a lot of value, right? But what that means is there's going to be a lot of change, and change is scary, right? Is that yeah? So, but that's the metaphor I like to give. We'll still be around. Yeah. Our industry is not going to go away, but it's going to be different. So don't ask me how, but it's going to be different.
Well, we're talking about change and risk, and I really like a phrase that you used, or a term that you used a moment ago, which is fine-tuning your content for AI. I think that's such an important call out there in terms of a soundbite. And you were also talking about things like, remind me, some of the old adage, make sure your content is of good quality. You're talking about titles. You're talking about, something your mentor taught you many years ago. And this importance when it comes to things like semantic data, the layout, the titles, how, are you answering the right questions? And I want to ask you about this because you're kind of talking here as well about matching your audience with your content, but now we've got this sort of AI in between. And when companies are operating globally, that localization, you were talking about translation there a moment ago, that localization and internationalization are probably more critical now than ever as our audiences are more global in nature. How are you ensuring that your technical documentation is accessible, it's relevant to diverse audiences across different markets, cultures, landscapes, and languages? Because as you said, the technology, whether it's MT, AI being deployed in translation type work in inverted commas, there still seems to be a very big role for that higher value change where the human in the loop, or the human at the core, the person who's got the eye on the quality controls, seems to be more important now than ever. I'm just wondering on your views on this, Nick.
So I can give a semi-informed view on that, right? So the last time I got any kind of real data in person interviewing developers is over 10 years ago. And the world has changed since then, right? But so nuanced answer. So the developers I spoke to, about half wanted the documentation in their native language and half didn't. Because even 10 years ago, what they did is they're developers. So they have like, 6 different monitors, right? Or however many. Right? One of the monitors had Google Translate open all the time. And what they would do is they would take the documentation in English, which is the sort of white label, as they call it, internationalization solution that many companies adopt, where you give it in English. And they would take that and they would copy it into Google Translate, and then they would get it in their native language. Right? And they liked that for a couple reasons. First off, they were more confident that that content in English would be more up to date, because there's always a like I like to call an offset, right? So when the English stuff is done, it takes time to get it into the other target languages, right? No matter how efficient you are, it takes time. So first off, they felt the English content was more reliably up to date. Second, they could go to a website like Stack Overflow, which many developers use, and have a deeper, well of insight from fellow developers to try to figure out how to solve whatever problem they're trying to work on, right? So I was looking at some of your previous podcasts, and I have a colleague, Mary Nurminen, or a former colleague, Mary Nurminen in Finland, who was talking about how non-translators use machine translation in one of your previous podcasts. And I think these developers are exactly the kind of people you're talking about. These are not professional translators, but they're using machine translation to get good enough translations into their target languages so that they can do whatever it is that they need to do. Right. So I think at one level, and by the way, we still don't know where this story ends. At one level, maybe having an automated machine translation plus AI solution for sort of the bulk stuff might be good enough for some of the things we need to do, right? And I can't say that's exactly what it is, but I think that might be where we're headed, right? But that's as I said, that's sort of bulk stuff, right? Now, if you're looking to acquire new customers from a market where people actually really, just as a sign of respect, would prefer to be addressed in their native language, right? Also, training for software engineers is different in different parts of the world. It's very noticeable how they interact with their documentation. Right? I'll call out, so, and by the way, Stack Overflow surveys say only about half of developers actually have formal training. The other have learned on the job, right? Those numbers might not be exactly correct, but the directional stuff. But my expectation is Japan, South Korea, and People's Republic of China, those software engineers typically have training that stresses more the value of the documentation, right? Now, software engineers trained in Europe, they might not say that, but I know from other research that they actually use the documentation as well. They just don't necessarily say they do, right? So I think there will still be a role for the sort of high-touch, human-in-the-loop stuff that is more valuable for allowing new customers to be acquired. So this been things like product descriptions, or basically your basic sort of description about what it is and what you need and all this other kind of stuff. But this is speculation. I don't know how this is going to go. But clearly, as I say, more text is being translated now than ever before, and I don't see this stopping. But the question is, how do we do it at scale, at speed, and at cost?
Well, that speed is a key word, and
Yeah.
you've kind of stepped me into the next thing I wanted to ask you about, because in this sort of dynamic content, rapid publication requirements, this cadence, the speed requirement for keeping up with the demand of your users, whether you're attracting new customers, supporting existing customers, launching something new, you've got to balance that speed requirements with maintaining those high standards, right, for clarity and accuracy, and in this instance, technical documentation. So any tips for balancing that speed requirement? Because everybody kind of wants it yesterday, but they also need it right.
So you've now asked a question that's right in my sweet spot, right? So I love baseball. So this is like a nice pitch over the plate, right? So I am a very vigorous advocate for an approach to documentation called Docs as code. Right. Now, I work with developer documentation. This solution doesn't work for everybody. Right. The other most prominent solution is sometimes called CCMS solutions, where you have these big databases full of topics that you manage. Right. And that's a very complex and very valuable way of doing things. But from a developer documentation point of view, yeah, Docs is code. We treat the documentation like code, even though it's actually not code. You need to talk with your organization about how you actually implement these things, because there are things where you're like, nah, that doesn't make sense for us, right? So in a Docs as code approach, you could be publishing constantly every 5 minutes, right? So it's this endless stream of changes, right? So that's rapid reaction, right? Is that now quality? How do you ensure quality when it's like standing in front of a fire hose where there's just content just spewing out, right? Well, that's automation, at least in some ways. Right. So a Ukrainian colleague of mine who I've had the great good fortune of working with in the past has been really done me the great good favor of educating things. And she tells me that, yeah, what you do as a writer is you should make a list of the 10 things that annoy you in your work. Right. Don't try to think of everything that you want to automate. Just make a list of the 10 things that really annoy you. Right. And then you maybe start thinking about, in a week, how much time do I spend on each of these things? And then you start thinking, well, how much of a human being is required for these things, right? So right now, as we're talking about AI, we're in a let 1,000 flowers bloom situation, right? So style guide compliance, a typical classic thing for tech comms writers, right? How do we maintain alignment with the way the company wants to express itself publicly in technical documentation? And there's a wide variety of solutions. Slack, for example, its documentation is very chatty format. Others have a very formal format, or sort of invisible author format, you could say. Right. So AI potentially, and I know people are playing around with this, but the results are not, I'm not really wondering. Yeah, we'll see. Right. Is that, and I know other people have been very happy that I still want to see practical test results. So AI, but there's also other automation you can do that's not related to AI, right? Is that so with Docs as code, there's CI/CD, continuous integration, continuous delivery. So one of the things you want to make sure is that the formatting is all correct and that it renders correctly. So that means every time you make a commit, sorry for the software documentation, jargon, you just build the document. You build it every single time, because we've had software since the 1960s. I don't know if anybody's seen this picture of the woman who coded the software for the Apollo moon launch. She was sort of a shorter woman, not extremely short, but shorter woman. And the pile of her code printed out was taller than she was, right? We've done software since the 1960s, and we know a lot of things. None of this is new. One of the things we know is the sooner you catch the error, the cheaper and quicker it is to fix. So when you're talking about quality, one of the things you try to do is you try to implement what I'm going to call pipelines, but just think of that as tools, where you can programmatically check to see if there are particular issues. Does the thing build? Is it formatted correctly? Right? Is that if it's PDF, there are tools you can use to see what's changed between the layout. Is it brand compliant? Are there certain words you shouldn't use for your company, maybe internal product names or something like that? You can scan the text for that kind of stuff, right? And the reality is, human beings, we have the most amazing computer in the world between our ears. But repetitive stuff we're not very good at, because your brain sort of freezes after a while looking at this. And we can use tools to check for these things. Right? That talked about value chain. That allows the writer to allocate their time to really sort of grasping at the fundamental level what they are doing advances the company's interests, rather than messing around with reformatting things or figuring out why the table doesn't lay out correctly, or oh my God, terminology management. Oh, that's very hard to do properly, really. And I know there's tons of tools out there, right? So, but just at the coal face, it's not always so easy, right? And now we have, again, non-regulated industry. So, we have the controlled English industries, which, like aviation and defense and things like that. That's a totally different thing, right? But again, that slows down the production of the content for good reasons, regulatory reasons. They have to do that, right? But if you're not in an industry where that is required, you often don't do that because it makes getting content out slower. But then it exposes you to all sort of terminology messiness that you need to manage, right? So make a list of the 10 things that annoy you and just figure out how you can maybe have some tooling to help you with these things. And that may or may not be AI.
And I liked what you said about that sort of 10 things that annoy you the most, then figuring
Yeah.
out how much human is required in some of this stuff
Yeah. Yeah.
versus tools or AI or a combination of both. And also a timely reminder as well for regulated industries, maybe, and how that can impact it, probably for the right reasons too. But that's where this just good enough isn't good enough.
I mean, so I've heard that I'm spreading rumors. I can't point at the actual case, but I have heard of a case of a medical device where the instructions led it to be set incorrectly, and it seriously injured the person in the medical device. This is why we have directives from the EU and equivalent legislation in other parts of the world about extreme control over those instructions for good reason, right? But that puts you in a very different world from the kind of world I live in. And that's why I like to make a very strong division between these things, right? So there are good reasons for those regulations, so you have to follow them.
So look, you've obviously got, a wealth of experience in this content technical sphere, documentation, writing, producing content. Are you seeing any trends? Obviously, you've seen a lot of changes over the years. You touched on earlier that bell curve in terms of the AI that we're all riding at the moment. But are there any trends that you can foresee at the moment, or anything that's sort of on your radar trend wise?
So again, call to my fellow colleagues in the profession. I think we need to take control over the AI conversation to figure out what it's useful for and what it's not useful for. Right. So I have a very good Portuguese colleague who's taught me a lot as well. And so the case he gives is that I have this massive amount of information that I need somehow to condense down into descriptions about whatever it is that the company needs. And so there are various AI solutions for doing that, right? Is that I have two people in my team who are investigating that, right? And I'm like, we'll see if it's useful or not. I don't know, right? But trends in the industry, almost everybody I talk to says their teams aren't big enough, right? They need more hands, and that's hard to do. So I think automation is something that we will need to really take a serious look at, right? And I'm not saying that'll replace the need for personnel, but what I'm saying is that'll make it easier to make the case to your leadership that, look, we're a good steward of company resources. We are deploying tools and automation and AI and whatever the next shiny object is appropriately to allow us to increase our productivity. We still need people. Right. But trends in the industry is that I would really like. So one of the nice things about this industry, that I love what I do for a living. I'm a very fortunate man, right? One of the nice things about this industry is you can pursue your passions. I know people who are really into user interface design, who are sort of either UI people or tech ready people. I know people are passionate about languages, who coordinate this localization thing you were talking about, internationalization, because that doesn't just work. You need to design it, right? Is that one of the other things I'm hoping to see is an entire sub-discipline in the industry of people who do prompt engineering, right? Is that really understanding the full suite of tools that are out there for us, figuring out how we leverage them to use them properly, right, is that I would like to see that be inside our industry, because I think that would allow us to sort of target how that would go. But in terms of trends change, I think we're going to see a wave of change come through.
Thanks, Nick. And look, two questions to wrap us up here, and they're important ones because we're talking here about change, as you just mentioned, and the technology is advancing very, very quickly, isn't it? So, how can people involved in this content, whether it's regulated or non-regulated type content, the technical writers, how do you stay current? Make sure that your documentation is relevant, it's accurate, it's saying the right things about you, but also, secondly, are there any sort of key skills that technical writers need to develop today to succeed in this increasingly busy, fast-changing environment that you could maybe touch on?
And by the way, the environment you're talking to, right, is I also know that you had the content wrangler on
That's right.
your website,
Yeah, Scott.
and
Yeah.
on your Scott on your podcast, and I was looking at some of the things he said and some of the things that the gentleman who maintains the I'd Rather Be Writing website as well, who is of course a guru for many people. The I'd Rather Be Writing was saying, Scott was saying, have a strategy, right? But I'd Rather Be Writing was saying, oh my God, this is exhausting, this level of change, right? So self-care first, right? I think we need to look out for ourselves, right? So if I present to writers, and I have long connections in the Finnish industry, right? So I often will present to writers in the tech comms classes there, and I also teach in Porto in the summer in Portugal. And I really get a lot of energy from meeting people who are just entering the industry. Is that I think the advice I give them is, so there's a Technical Communications Society for Writers in Finland, the Finnish Technical Communications Society, oddly enough for a name. And I live in Germany, and so there's TECOM, of course, and there's also TECOM Europe. I think that we as a community need to reach out to each other through whatever organization is appropriate. Portugal's Apicom Tech, right? Reach out to your colleagues as we go through this change thing. Talk with them about what have you tried, what works, what didn't work, what's the wrong path to go down, what works for you. Oh, but you have these particular requirements for your company that doesn't apply to us, right? So maybe that's not for us, right? I would encourage people to reach out to their colleagues and network, but through whatever is appropriate for you, whether it's conferences, societies, there's vigorous LinkedIn channels, there's all sorts of other sort of venues, right? Is you're not alone. The industry as general is facing these challenges. And I think it feels less impossible if you have a chance to talk with your colleagues, right? Now, what I told the students when I last talked to them, which was, I think, in the fall in Finland, is I said, because the Finnish industry long has a concern of how do people enter the industry, right? How do new people, because one of my concerns for AI is, does this take the jobs away that the people entering the industry used to do, right? Does entering the industry now have a higher bar to getting into it, right? Because if we're talking about efficiency improvements, some of the work you might have given to more junior people might not even be quote unquote there anymore, right? So that's always been a concern in the Finnish industry. How do we have the next generation come? And I told the students, you are very, very lucky. Nobody knows how AI is supposed to work. Right? Is that go figure out what it can do, what it can't do, what it's useful for, what it's not useful for. Because there are things it can do that I don't care about. Right? Whatever, fantastic, but who cares? Right? Is that figure it out. That way you have some control over your own destiny. If somebody comes to you and say, hey, we should do AI for X. And you're like, well, I saw a conference presentation. But for Y, yes, we should do that. Right? Is because I think that gives you a basis to make sort of have these discussions inside wherever it is that you work. Right. So you can tell I'm very much let's be in control of our destiny type of guy. Right.
Well, that's good, Nick, and I really appreciate what you've said there. You give people some great advice, some things to think about, and also when you're talking about does it take away that sort of entry into a certain industry? I think that's a real thing because humans tend to get in and then move up in terms of
Yep.
experience. But if the getting point has changed significantly, that has ramifications. So that's a smart way of thinking about it too.
Well, and it's particularly a problem for the tech comms industry, I would maintain. Because the thing is that Finland, we have a number of programs for tech comms. And I'm talking about Finland because it's the area I know best, but also Germany has training as well, right? So there's formal training, which often then has internships, which allows you to get into the industry, right? But the thing is, this is such a diverse field. It is not literally possible for any program to teach you everything that you could possibly do. Everything from like parts catalogs for companies that issue complex industrial equipment to developer documentation for software, where I'm like, it's been 20 years since I've worked on anything that physically exists. Is that we're all writers. We have a commonality of understanding our audience, figuring out what information to provide them, how to provide that information to them. All that's common, but it's so diverse. And what that means is that even if you are fortunate enough to have training, and many people in my generation in Finland, we learned on the job, is sort of assumption is you'll be taught the first place you work. And so that means, I mean, I think I have some concerns about our marketing colleagues as well, right? Because if the lower level stuff is being done by AI, and that was the stuff you started with, how do you get started and get that experience in order to get into the flow of things? That's not the AI industry's responsibility to solve that problem for us, but I do think it is the responsibility of our collective organizations and us ourselves to figure that out, right? But for the students, you're not doomed. Nobody knows AI yet, so learn that. And if you can have an intelligent discussion in the job interview about that, you're the same level as everybody else.
Well, Nick, do you know what? That's a great point to close today's show. And I want to thank everybody who's been watching or listening to the VistaTalks episode today with Nick Hill. And I'm going to invite you to join me back here. Well, hopefully we'll be discussing some more interesting topics with interesting people from all around the world. But Nick, thanks for being on the show. Thanks for sharing your knowledge, expertise, and views. It's been a real pleasure today.
Thank you for inviting me to talk to your audience. It's as I say, I'm passionate about my industry, so it's always nice to share.